This series of Climate Champions is sponsored by the Wholesome Foundation to promote its Global Sustainable Design Awards program. The Swiss-based Wholesome Foundation for Sustainable Construction, created by building materials and aggregates company Wholesome in 2003, supports these awards to champion international exemplars of sustainable design. With a deadline of February 11, 2025, the free-to-enter awards feature a $1 million prize fund and are open to client-supported and commissioned projects in the detailed design phase that are not yet complete. Projects under construction are eligible so long as their completion date is after 11 February 2025. If you have a project in the pipeline which meets these criteria, I urge you to consider entering these awards. Last year's winners included the Natural History Museum's Urban Nature Project, designed by Field and Fowles with landscape architects J&L Gibbons. Find out more in our show notes or at wholesomefoundation.org. You're listening to Climate Champions, a podcast from the Architects Journal. I'm your host, Hattie Hartman, Sustainability Editor at the AJ. Welcome to the second episode in this series, which is about inspirational retrofit projects. We're looking at projects that go above and beyond conventional retrofit to deliver astonishing results. Today's project, as you will hear, delivers immense social value for its community, in addition to the physical upgrade of a spectacular heritage building. My co-host for this series is Rachael Owens. Rachael is an architect and head of sustainability at Buckley Gray Yeoman and a director at the National Retrofit Hub.
Effectively, community engagement is about making something bigger happen beyond asking what people like, what they need. It's actually even more than that. It's saying, what can you do? It's about giving people the power to change their environments and making them feel part of it. In fact, actually, it becomes the people who are the project.
Our guest today is Sarah Castle of IFDO, an AJ 40 under 40 practice founded a decade ago to work on diverse, generous, and inclusive projects that look beyond the boundaries of a site. Today, the practice is up to 18 employees with several award-winning projects, including the Brent Cross Town substation for client Related Argent, a timber community center in Enfield, North London, a Meanwhile community hub near Waterloo Station, and a beach house on the Suffolk coast shortlisted for the Manser Medal, as well as the inaugural Dulwich Picture Gallery Pavilion for the London Festival of Architecture in 2017. Today we are talking about the work that IFDO has undertaken in Hastings, East Sussex, for social enterprise Hasting Commons. This work centers around the refurbishment of the grand 1924 Observer Building, which had suffered more than 3 decades of neglect when IFDO was approached about the project. The first phase of IFDO's work, documented in an AJ building study in July, created a cultural venue with exhibition, theater, and music spaces, workspace, a cafe, and gym on the lower floors. The crumbling faience facade has been repaired and an overall thermal upgrade undertaken. More on that shortly. In this episode, we talk a lot about collaboration, an approach which is at the heart of IFDO's work. Collaboration is often tossed about as a convenient buzzword. We'll be talking to Sarah about how IFDO ensures that collaboration is meaningful so that it really works. Sarah, in Hastings, the reach of your work goes way beyond retrofitting a specific building. Can you start by telling us how you got involved with the work in Hastings and a bit about Hasting Commons and the context of the Community Land Trust for listeners who may not be familiar with what's been brewing in Hastings over the last decade?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose this project really emerges from a total reimagining of what it means to do urban regeneration, particularly in coastal communities. And this is kind of seen through the lens of Hastings Commons. And I wanted just to start by explaining what commoning is, because I think this is pretty fundamental to the way that Hastings Commons works. And it's actually this ancient practice of land management or resource management, which is about mutual benefit. So we're saying that, there's resources here, but they're shared and they should be shared across the community. And what Hastings Commons do is try to reimagine that kind of way of working, but addressing more contemporary challenges. So what does the CLT mean here? It means that there's an active participation in terms of shaping your environment and building supportive communities. And it's really not an abstract thing. And it's not, as you say, something that's just banded around. It's about knowing your neighbours. It's about contributing to local upkeep and having agency and decision making in the way that your kind of community and urban environment is built. And what's really distinctive as well is like the diversity of that group. So they're not united by background. There's tenants, teams, team members, trustees, the design team included. Everybody shares a social conscience and a commitment to the place and kind of making that place better. So since 2014, when Hastings Commons was formed, it's brought, I think, 8,500 square metres of space into community ownership. So it's a genuine alternative model. And, also people talk about social infrastructure a lot. This really truly is 8,500 square metres of social infrastructure. So when we became involved, that was in 2019. It was just around the time that the Hastings Commons acquired the Observer building and engaged us to lead the transformation of that building. And since then, obviously, we've been working hand in hand with them on that building and also as architects for other buildings within the Commons, including Eagle House, which is another community hub, just kind of a few doors down.
Yeah, we thought it would be really interesting to explore what that actually means in terms of the building itself, and how the fact that the building is owned by a community land trust affects the building and its users and the way that the space is developed and the decisions you made. I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, actually, I was speaking to our client, Jess Steele, who's the CEO of Hastings Commons, just yesterday about this. Her words, not mine. It's about forever, which I actually loved. It's about affordability and perpetuity. So the Community Land Trust is about providing a legal framework. So that ensures that the buildings remain in community ownership with, for instance, rents capped at a third of the local average income. With the housing particularly, it's a different form of affordable housing. It's not kind of a classic definition. I mean, more broadly, what does that actually mean? It means we have to approach the project very differently as architects. I think it's unlike a traditional development model. It means that we're prioritising long-term community benefit over a quick financial return. So that starts to influence more or less every aspect of what we're trying to do. So, for instance, firstly, thinking about design decisions. So what's the implication of a CLT ownership on a design project? It means that we have to design for flexibility, for adaptability. We have to focus on low running costs for that community affordability. Again, it's about forever. We prioritise essential improvements over cosmetic enhancements. And I think as architects, we can sometimes get a bit overexcited about, what the colours and tiles are going to be. But actually, that is important. And it being a warm and welcoming environment is super important. But actually, it just has to work from the perspective of it being robust and being well insulated and easy to look after. And I think the other thing is to say that the spaces that we're creating have to be really diverse and mixed use so they can function for different community needs. And I think something that I'm sure we'll probably end up talking about is the idea of strategic phasing.
So the question I wanted to ask related to this is, how did you navigate the jigsaw of funding pots from historic England for the building upgrade to youth funds for spaces for young people and the timelines to actually enable this project to happen? I came across this because I recently did a building study of Price Gore's primary arts project in Nottingham, where they are refurbishing a school for an arts charity. And it just seems to be a whole other skill set which is critical to actually enabling the project to happen, to understand these funding streams.
Yeah, it's a really kind of different way of approaching development projects. So across Hasting Commons, I believe that they've had more than 100 grants and loans to do what is about a decade's worth now of regeneration in Hastings. I think we have to start with the way that we approach that, and that is about procurement, and it's what we call phased organic development, or POD. It needs to be really clear what that means, which is you do a bit, you get some people in. You do a bit more, then you get some more people in. And it's because, in our clients' words again, that you haven't actually planned out what's going to happen. You have a framework and you have an idea as to what that final project might be, but you don't know in its entirety.
And when you say you get some people in, what do you mean? You mean tenants or
exactly
people to use the space?
Yeah, so like we're filling a building before the building's finished, and it's difficult and dangerous for architects and also for the developers, and but it's kind of fun and it's a real challenge. Now, what that means in terms of grant funding is it's actually helpful. It's part of the reason for working like that in terms of phasing, is that each funding stream has really specific requirements and timelines, and they require this really careful coordination. So, for instance, on the Observer building, we have Historic England for building upgrades and facade restoration. We have various smaller government grants and charity grants, which are kind of really allocated to specific parts of the building. Youth Investment Fund for young people's spaces, homes funding for the residential parts, which are coming up later. So the implementation strategy and the way that we manage those funding pots is really tied in with the way that the building's designed. So the project's broken down into the kind of manageable phases. Each phase has to be designed to be viable. You have to create an infrastructure to support future phases. So we have to think about the way those funding pots actually can enable future. It's not just literally about the way that they apply to the bit that they're actually funding. And we also have to build flexibility into the design so that should the funding change further down the line, that we're kind of able to be nimble and redevelop. So, again, I think as I mentioned before, we prioritise essential structural work and infrastructure for the building, but we actually also have to kind of future-proof what's going to happen in those later stages. But really, the kind of crux of it is that it comes down to is a careful allocation of that specific funding to the eligible elements. It's not just the early stages that it kind of affects. It's also looking at monthly valuations and thinking, okay, is this working? Because it's not as simple as bill arrives, pay bill. It's, which elements of this are allocated to different funding pots, and you also can't promise one element of a building to more than one funder. So it's a real kind of jigsaw in terms of pulling it together. So a very different way to approach the kind of early and latter stages of design and construction.
I imagine this might be something that we touch on later, but it sounds like it might also enable more sort of momentum building and transparency in the community as you're releasing bits at a time. So it's not just everything happening behind closed doors and woohoo, we've launched a fully finished building. Would you like to take some space in it? But I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the sort of history of the Observer building itself. We know that there were more than a dozen previous owners. There were several planning permissions. None of them worked, but your scheme does. And I wondered if you could reflect a bit on what does your scheme do differently that you think made it successful where all of those other plans weren't?
I kind of wanted to, again, frame this through the eyes of our client, which is to reframe the understanding of success versus failure in development, and the difference between working with a community-led developer as opposed to a kind of for-profit standard development model. And in Jess's words, the previous approaches actually didn't fail. As she kind of would say, they succeeded in their intended aim, which is making money from the building. Now, if that's your intention and your desire, and that's the kind of the basis on which you're doing property development, then the previous kind of attempts on the building were very successful. So there were 13 owners over 34 years, all of whom we believe profited from the sale whilst the building deteriorated. So that's really a kind of reflection on the way our property system works at the moment. So this approach succeeded but in a different way. Because if you're prioritising profit, then the building just didn't stack up beyond REBA stage 3 in the kind of traditional development sense. It just cost too much money to build out that. It's a really complicated building. It's literally made on caves. You know, at the bottom of the building, it's kind of rock with caves kind of dug out of it. It's a concrete frame building. It's got a beautiful ornate faience facade. There was so many problems with this building. So the money could be made through the planning stages, but it never would be able to be made through the REBA stage 4, REBA stage 5, because there's just too much to do and the market rates don't stack up in Hastings. So when you've got a client with different motivations, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. So the success of Hasting Commons with the Observer building is about that kind of new motivation. It's about community benefit rather than profit maximisation. It's about long-term stewardship rather than speculation. It's about social value. It's about accessibility. So if you have somebody like Jess, like the team at Hasting Commons, who are really expert in raising money, then this is an opportunity created for that community. And suddenly it can make sense because you're able to access grant funding where other developers might not chase it in the same way. So a success can happen because the motivations are different and because you're seeing it through a much, much longer term lens than a kind of an immediate financial one.
So just to unpick that a little bit, where did you start? You had this massive building with so many issues. How did what are the baby steps at the beginning to unravel this and get started?
Okay, where do we start? I think at the point at which we arrived on the project, the building was more or less falling apart. So the faience was falling off. So the faiences are kind of like that very ornate facade. If you've seen any photographs of the building, there were kind of literally plants growing out of it, but also bits of it were falling off. It was a total hazard on the street. There was also a structural concrete frame that over time, because of salt, it's right really close to the sea. We're in Hastings, we're like 1 block away from the sea. So it's not just rain that's causing a problem, it's corrosive salt water that's causing a problem there. And when nobody had actually done any repairs for 34 years, the kind of building is literally crumbling. There'd been people who'd broken in, so it had been used for many different reasons. I mean, one could argue community reasons, but in a way that wasn't necessarily preserving the fabric of the building, and it wouldn't have lasted much longer in that form. So whilst it's a big, hefty concrete frame, the rebar had started to show because the concrete had started to fall off. So it was at real risk of total structural failure. So what are the first steps? The first steps are trying to stabilise the building. So the point at which we arrive, our client had taken really key steps just to stabilise the building as it was. So they couldn't yet kind of take steps to retrofit it, to kind of start to make it habitable in a more permanent sense, but they were doing repairs to the concrete work and really making sure that they were making the facade safe, even just through the medium of nets and scaffolding to kind of prevent it from being damaging to passers-by and being a safety hazard, to be honest. Also note that the only inhabitants of the building at that point were pigeons, who have been a very important part of the story today of the Observer building. And in fact, the building is, well, at least the first phase is complete now, and there is a statue of a pigeon in the front hall as you walk in to kind of pay homage to the tenants of the building for the 34 years till we took over. So yeah, first steps, stabilise the building and make sure that as you're fundraising, you're prioritising funds that are really about those kind of like trying to make the building safe to occupy. And then we can kind of, those are the must-haves. The nice-to-haves are like kind of come later, and they are things like the upgrades that enable it to have that kind of more permanent occupation.
So you mentioned the building's faience facade, and it's really intricately detailed. We wondered how you approached its restoration. So did you encounter any specific heritage constraints, and how did you work with those? You mentioned that part of that work had also been funded by Historic England, I think. So it would be good to understand how they played a role in that as well.
The building isn't listed, but despite that, the Cambridge Road facade is of real historic and community significance. So certainly the local planners and conservation officers were very, very interested in what was happening to that. It was really about a kind of careful balance of preservation and renewal. So, of course, securing it and making it safe, as I said before, was really important. How do you start that? We actually worked with Donald Insall on the facade work. So they were brilliant assistants in kind of helping create a scope and specification for the works to that really ornate facade. It's really complicated because every single piece of the facade is different. So it's not the same as, like, oh, it's all lovely glazed brick, so let's just buy some where they're broken. Actually, it's really complicated because some of the pieces are bigger than me and, they're really, really heavy. So we started off with a really detailed condition survey, historic research, documentation. We collaborated not only with kind of specialist consultants, but also with the conservation officers and the local authority to develop this kind of specialist restoration approach, which said how we were going to kind of carry out the repair of the facade and restoration of the facade in a way that everybody would be happy with. And it wasn't cheap. So that's where kind of Historic England came in. And, we did quite a lot of tours with them explaining what the work would be and how this would be brought back up to not only a safe facade, but something that actually kind of just restored the former glory of this building. And, it had a real civic presence. And when you see something where there's literally bits of a facade falling off, it was kind of dragging down the area. In terms of a technical solution, we scanned individually the different pieces of the facade and 194 new faience tiles were fabricated. There was over 50% mortar replacement. We had new stainless steel support brackets, so it ties it back to that concrete frame. And we also had this specially developed cleaning solution, which was about the kind of ones that had been there for a long time. Because if you put in new pieces of faience, actually the stuff that's been there for 100 years looks a bit grubby next to it. And actually that's something I actually quite like. But at least to kind of even it out in the first instance, we were kind of looking at lots of different washes, and it took us a long time to get the right solution so that it didn't kind of take back too much and it kind of balanced really well. It was all about kind of this really collaborative approach to achieving something that balanced kind of preservation, but also said, there are some new pieces here. And actually, even where you can see where we've had to anchor in, for instance, scaffolding, we've had to refill those holes or where chips had come out of some of the existing faience, and we've repaired small bits within it locally rather than replacing the whole tile. You can see where those repairs are. But I think that's kind of the joy of it, because, it's a 100-year-old building, and actually, it's quite nice to show that this kind of repair work has been part of its story, not something we have to hide.
Well, I just wanted to ask, kind of in terms of something you touched on before, and in terms of the objectives of your client, the meticulous restoration of this historic facade seems to kind of tip into that area that, is kind of beyond what your client might consider top priority. So, they have a broader social agenda. And this sounds hugely expensive. So how did you balance all that? And how did you decide how far to go?
As I touched upon before, I think if you hadn't touched the facade, A, it would have been unsafe, and B, it really was quite a depressing thing to look at, because you could tell it was something that had been absolutely magnificent. The question for the client is, how much money can you spend, and how much money can we raise through various grant funds and loans? And what happens if we don't spend this money now? And the problem is that if you don't repair the facade properly, we could have been in a situation where water would get further into, for instance, cracks between various mortar joints within existing tiles, and actually forced it to push off and cause further damage to the facade. So really it was kind of a rescue job that cost a lot of money, but could have cost a lot more money if we hadn't done it to this level. I think the client was equally bothered about the appearance, and also trying to kind of do a job that meant that they weren't having to go back up with scaffolding in 5 years' time to spend more money because of inflation or because there was more damage to it. So it kind of was also quite a sensible financial decision.
It is an incredible building. Because of Hastings' topography, it has street access on 3 different floors, I think, alley, ground, and first, and spectacular sea views from the roof. Part of your work included improving the energy efficiency, performance, and comfort of the building. So what fabric and services upgrades did you do as part of the retrofit, and how did you prioritize the different measures?
Yeah, I mean, again, when we arrived, the building was pretty much a shell. As I mentioned before, there'd been a kind of lot of damage within inside the building, but also the windows were smashed, where they were kind of like the beautiful conservation, like Crittall style windows at the front. The lead was missing, or lead seals were stolen in some instances. The internal surfaces had been completely stripped. There was no, more or less very poor / no thermal performance because it was just, brick to air. No functioning services, the high moisture levels. So really significant heat loss. So you can't just pop people in there and hope for the best because, and most of the windows were boarded up, so there wasn't any natural light in there either. So really anything we would do would have been an improvement. But again, if we just come back to this point about what is actually beneficial to a building that remains in community ownership, and that is actually doing the best we possibly can in terms of a thermal upgrade to the building, in terms of getting the right systems into it. So how deep do we go? I mean, as deep as possible. So we focus on reducing running costs. So thinking about what's practical, what's maintainable, what's the balance between the cost and performance of each of those services, and what's essential. And also thinking about future-proofing it for later phases, because if some of the floors are going to remain empty for now, but there in the future, the services that we specify, in this early process have to be able to perform to a high enough level to support the future phases. So again, this is really complicated from a funding perspective because we're effectively trying to balance different funding pots where we're saying, well, this is kind of for these floors, but it's actually for the whole building when the whole building is occupied. In terms of what we did, we put loads of insulation into the building. So I think, from an aesthetic point of view, it's lovely to see the beautiful concrete walls. It was so lovely to see that. But, practically speaking, it's not very helpful for a community building. As trendy and beautiful as it could have looked if we had left the concrete exposed, sadly, we covered it with insulation. And that is really important because it totally obviously improves the performance. We have triple glazing now throughout the building. We replaced all of the kind of Crittall style windows in the faience facade with equivalent kind of Crittall triple glazed windows. We've got air source heat pumps now on the roof that provide heating and hot water. We have PV panels just going in on the roof. We're doing the roof extension at the moment. In terms of the MEP systems, we have MVHR on most floors, which, again, is really helpful from the perspective of kind of reducing the overall costs of heating the building. We've got PIR controlled LED lighting, grey water harvesting for toilets, lots of these kind of technical things, but really it was about starting with the fabric, which I think, is a fairly done thing now, but it was so important for us to get this right because the main target, the main briefing item that we have is to say, let's try and keep this cheap for the community.
One of the things we talk a lot about in the National Retrofit Hub is trying to increase people's expectations on the performance of their homes in particular. Lots of people already think that their home performs well enough, but they're still worried about their energy bills. We've got really low expectations in this country on what we should expect from thermal comfort. So I can imagine it also plays a great role in allowing people to experience what it is like to be in a really thermally comfortable, well-ventilated building that incorporates these technologies and that sort of feeling. So I wondered if we could explore a bit more about the role that the community plays in the success of the project and how you engaged. I'm imagining you were engaging before, during and after, and how did that work?
Absolutely. Obviously, it's become part of the planning process. When I first started out, it's like, oh, it's really good. We did some community engagement. Effectively, community engagement is asking people if they like what you designed. Is that good enough? No. So the way that Hasting Commons see engagement, which I would say is 100% shared by IFDO, is that it's way beyond that, asking people if you like what they do. It's about something that goes much deeper. So typically short-term transactional. Jess describes it as thinking about two cogs. So if you think about two cogs and the way they move together, kind of locked in with each other, it's making something bigger happen. And that's a really nice way of thinking about engagement. And we also, because of this kind of phased organic development and having people occupying the space, it's engagement by osmosis. It's about being there for years and years and listening to what people say. And Jess also talks about it as being beyond asking what people like, what they need. It's actually even more than that. It's saying, what can you do? So with the CLT, what's interesting about it is saying, okay, that's what you like. Okay, that's what you need. But do you want to do this? Can you lead this? Could you be part of this project? In fact, actually, it becomes the people who are the project. And that's all about kind of the way they work as a CLT. It's about giving people the power to change their environments and making them feel part of it. So, of course, I can tell you about what we did as architects and designers, and it was really extensive. I mean, at the point at which we arrived, there'd been I think more or less a decade of conversations on what should be happening in that area. The community had saved that building. They'd been thinking about what to do with it. When we came in, there was extensive consultation on the building use, on brief writing. We had carried out co-design workshops. We had a public forum. We broadcasted on a live TV station during COVID called Isolation Station Hastings. We've had youth engagement programmes. There's been workshops teaching local people how to build parts of the building. We're learning, constantly learning, and it's all about that listening and getting people to kind of be part of that process rather than just saying, hey, we drew something cool, do you like it?
We've talked a lot about the observer building per se. How does that fit into the other buildings and activities that the Community Land Trust has already got going? Can you just set it in context a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the observer building isn't finished to start off with. So we've got a phase one that's complete. It's a 4,000 square metre building. The kind of vast majority of the external envelopes finished, including the faience. And there's now a gym, there's a tech hub, there's a huge community event space that holds everything from raves to weddings. It literally had a wedding in it the other day, which was so exciting. It has loads of co-working and low-cost affordable workspace in it. But still to come is, the kind of community roof terrace, roof extensions and bespoke affordable housing that's capped at that kind of lower rent, which will be on the second and third floor. So it's going to be an 8-storey building, which is full of all of these kind of community uses that give it resilience, but also mean that it's offering stuff to lots and lots of different types of people. For instance, we're also working on Eagle House, which is a building that we're retrofitting just a few doors down on Cambridge Road. And that includes, at the moment, kind of still more low-cost workspace, which is great, but there really, in that building, is a youth focus to it. So we've been working with local young people on that. There's also a building called 12 Claremont, who Purcell are working on, which is beautiful, beautiful building next door to the library, again, within this very small, not very small, this small area of Hastings, the White Rock area. And again, they're doing slightly different community functions. So each of them are kind of a mixture of workspace, residential, support, events, all of these variety of uses that all really knit together.
Yeah, I think when you visit, it's really clear that there is a strong sense of community in Hastings. It feels like quite a special place, and they have lots of events all throughout the year as well. So I wondered if we could talk a little bit about how this project and the work of Hasting Commons can teach us about urban renewal and what that's like in the face of gentrification. And could you see this approach working in other locations or in larger cities?
It probably isn't necessarily slowing gentrification. I think what it does, what Hasting Commons do, is they create protected spaces within a changing market. So what's gentrification? Gentrification is about affluent people moving to a place, and probably it ends up looking nicer as well. It either was nicer and that's why they moved there, or they moved there and it was looking a bit nicer and then it gets even nicer because there's more money there. So the problem with affluent people moving to an area where there hasn't historically or recently been a lot of money is that rents go up and the people who are there can't afford to be there anymore. So what Hasting Commons look to do is carve out places within a kind of sphere of gentrification where people can still go, and because they are still affordable. So it's kind of allowing affordability to exist within gentrification. And also that affordability has to be in perpetuity. So I was thinking about this a lot recently and whether there's any applicability to London. The principles are potentially transferable, but they require adaptation. I think, in London, the property costs are higher. There's a really complex planning environment, although actually it's pretty complex in Hastings from time to time. There's market pressures, and the scale of intervention probably in London would be different. So I don't know, but I think more broadly, just thinking about the way that people might take it forward in their local neighbourhoods is just thinking about what the requirements are for success. So I think it's having somebody who's able to raise capital, somebody who's an expert in fundraising, particularly grant fund applications can be really complicated. So having somebody who's good at that is just really important. Having a strong community organisation. And again, with Hasting Commons, the way they talk about it is having a kit of parts. So everybody brings something different to the table. You might have a bit of understanding of planning. You might know how to put up shelves. It doesn't matter what it is. Everybody brings something to the table. And actually, it's the combination of skill sets that really make that organisation strong. Ideally have a supportive local authority. That really is helpful if you have that. And then also obviously the technical expertise from a very passionate design team. So we feel like we're partners in this. We love working with our clients on this project. It's just a delight, and it's been 5 years of work for us so far. And I have to say it's been a lot of commitment, a lot of hard work, but it's brought a huge amount of joy to our team to be part of it.
Amazing. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and ask you what other work the practice has in the pipeline.
Pretty excitingly, we're kind of continuing to work through what we call social infrastructure, but broadly speaking, projects which have positive impacts on communities. At the moment, we're just setting sail on a really interesting project in Wythenshawe in Manchester, which is where I'm from. I'm really excited to be doing that. Wythenshawe was where I was born, where my daughter was born, and they've got a civic centre, which we're going to be working on for Muse with FCBS, Field and Clegg Bradley Studio, to kind of really work with the local community there and make some brilliant interventions. We're doing some similar work as well in Lewisham with Lansec UNI. So really exciting stuff, but all community focused, really kind of making sure that we're celebrating people and making spaces where people feel really welcome and included. So when I was preparing this episode, I came across an interview where you were asked to name your favorite building. And I was surprised to find that you chose Oscar Niemeyer's Museum of Contemporary Art in Niterói across the bay from Rio. And this building is close to my heart because it was actually the subject of my very first building study that I wrote more than 25 years ago. But I wouldn't call it a favorite building. It's spectacular, but not necessarily a favorite. And then you also mentioned Manchester's Whitworth Gallery and its extension by MoMA. And this I would consider a favorite. And these buildings seem so opposite. Niemeyer's space satellite is a purist object in a spectacular landscape. The other one is the museum is much more about context. So I just wanted to ask you to comment on this, and what are your thoughts? Gosh, I'm not 100% sure I'd answer the same today. I think it depends on my mood.
Yes.
I love both of them. I've been lucky enough to go to both of them. So I was in Brazil a number of years ago and went to the Oscar Niemeyer building, and it's just magnificent. And I think a lot of the time, when we're talking about architecture, we can get really bogged down in technical and pragmatic considerations. What that building has is joy. It is just knockout. There's a moment where you're kind of walking up the ramp to it. It just it fills your heart. So there are probably a million different problems with it and a million reasons not to pick it. But it's one of the buildings where I felt most in awe. The scale, the way that it kind of sits with the sea and the mountains in the distance, and it makes you feel something. And I think that's an important point. Let's not forget beauty. Let's not forget joy. That's what that has. What does the Whitworth have? The Whitworth's really close to my house. So I love it. I take my daughter there, and you feel like you're literally in a tree canopy, and it's gorgeous. And my daughter loves it. And there's something beautiful about the way that they carried out that extension and knitted it in with the existing building in a way that just feels effortless. The landscape's amazing around it. They've just got it right. And, if my daughter's happy running around up and down the corridors and I'm happy looking at the way it feels like it's in the trees, then it's a good building.
So you live in Manchester and you have a young child. Can you comment on the challenges of running a busy London practice and a project in Hastings with multiple demands on your time? How do you manage it all?
With difficulty? No, it's okay. It's manageable. I'm in London 2 days a week. I have a supportive family. I feel quite strongly that I've worked really hard for my career, and that as a woman in a kind of leadership role, that it's really good to kind of be a role model for my daughter. I'm really happy in what I do, and so I can manage the complexities of it as long as my daughter sees that I'm happy and doing something that I love, and I hope the same for her.
That's really inspirational.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. Really interesting to hear more about Hastings. Just all this work you're doing, and now you're bringing it to Manchester.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Well, I've yet to find a big crumbling faience building that somebody will let us have a go at. But if anybody's listening to this, they should probably just give us a call.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much.
So that's it. Thanks for listening to Climate Champions, a podcast from the Architects Journal. Our next guest in a fortnight will be Tom Briscoe of Briscoe Loran Architects. This series of Climate Champions is sponsored by the Wholesome Foundation to promote its Global Sustainable Design Awards program. The Swiss-based Wholesome Foundation for Sustainable Construction, created by building materials and aggregates company Wholesome in 2003, supports these awards to champion international exemplars of sustainable design. With a deadline of February 11th, 2025, the free-to-enter awards feature a $1 million prize fund and are open to client-supported and commissioned projects in the detailed design phase that are not yet complete. Projects under construction are eligible so long as their completion date is after 11 February 2025. If you have a project in the pipeline which meets these criteria, I urge you to consider entering these awards. Last year's winners included the Natural History Museum's Urban Nature Project, designed by Field and Fowles with landscape architects J&L Gibbons. Find out more in our show notes or at wholesomefoundation.org. Thanks to our producer, May Robson. Our theme music is Foro dos Dois Amigos by Edmilson de Pifano, interpreted by Felipe Tanaka e Banda Balaio de Bayan. Don't forget to leave us a review and hit subscribe for new shows wherever you get your podcasts.